are today's conversation so that we can put that on our YouTube page and share that with people going forward. And also just a reminder that as we are recording, we're going to ask that you do please keep yourself on mute during the presentation and refrain from any inappropriate comments or anything like that if you are asked to unmute. Our presenters will be speaking for you and we'll be monitoring the chat as you have questions, so feel free to put them in the chat. If it's something that we think can be addressed in the moment, we stop the presentation to address the questions, but generally we're going to try and hold them until after the presentation. Again, thank you all very much for joining us today again for today's community conversation, Inherited Wisdom, drawing on the lessons of formerly enslaved ancestors to lift up Black youth. We are joined today by Dr. Barbara Milton and Dr. Deborah Brooks Lawrence, who are authors of the book of the similar title, and they're going to be talking to us about their research and work and what we can learn from their work. So Barbara and Deborah, thank you so much for joining us. Let me turn the conversation over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you so much, NASW New Jersey, my favorite chapter. Filled with all my favorite people.
Ours too.
Before we start, I want to do a little bit of a ritual. And that is because we are talking about the ancestors. I would like to take a moment to evoke the ancestors into our conversation, into the space today. I'm going to pour a libation. A libation is a very common ritual done in West Africa. It is a way to bring in the spirits of the ancestors into the space so they can guide us and be with us through our conversation. So I ask for a moment of silence, and as I pour this libation, think about your ancestors, who you'd like to bring into this space. And let's do that with the reverence of silence while we pour the libation. I'm bringing into this space my grandmother, my mother, and my great-grandmother, and all of the Miltons that go as far back as fighters in the Civil War, buried in Florida, buried in North Carolina, John Milton, Walter Milton, William Milton, bringing them into this space. When I was 15 years old, a doctor said to me, "You are the epitome of resilience, Barbara." I had had a very difficult childhood. I knew it was irregular. It was filled with abuse and neglect. And yet somehow I was a top student. Yet somehow I was a class athlete, a class A athlete. Yet somehow I was able to sustain many relationships. And I didn't know it at the time until that doctor said to me, "You are the epitome of resilience." And that has stayed with me all my life. What is resilience? Resilience is the ability to fight through adversity. It is the ability to move through difficulty, to overcome. It is to bounce back, right? And this topic intrigued me so much that when I was a doctoral student at City University in New York, and I was contemplating a topic to study, I thought, let me really explore this notion of Black resilience. let me explore this notion of the roots of Black resilience. And fortunately, there was a body of literature housed in the Library of Congress that gave me some first-person stories from formerly enslaved Blacks in America that the Roosevelt administration in 1934 decided to interview formerly enslaved Black Africans in America, and they teased out their story. Are anyone here familiar with the slave narratives? If so, raise your hand. Anybody familiar with that body of literature housed at the Library of Congress? Any show of hands here?
Yeah, I see one person has their Zoom hand up.
Okay. Yeah, I see that. Yep. Okay. Right. There are over 2,000 of these stories housed in the Library of Congress, digitized thanks to a grant by the Gates Foundation. So this is a body of literature we all have access to anytime we want to. It's called Born in Bondage. And it is a collection of interviews. It was a standardized questionnaire that formerly employed or ex-employed newspaper reporters, journalists, novelists, it was a scheme, it was like a stimulus package, right, to hire, to get money into the hands of these formerly employed persons. And they went out and searched 17 Southern states, and they found these people who were born in slavery. And then they interviewed them. And that interview consisted of pearls of wisdom about their, not just the things we know about enslavement, which is the horror and the brutality of subjugation and oppression and systemic institutional oppression, but also what's transmitted through these stories is their resilient story, is the way they overcame, is the way they got through it, is the way they bounced back from it. It is the way they maintain their dignity and their esteem, right? And so what I decided to do in my doctoral dissertation was to analyze a sample of these slave narratives so that I could tease out this resilience story. I call it original Black resilience. And part one was identifying some of the strategies, behavioral, attitudinal strategies that were employed by these formerly enslaved persons, but also how can we make use of that wisdom and target it toward a population of vulnerable youth, because I was an adolescent therapist, a clinical social worker working with adolescents. How do I take that wisdom and then apply it to Black youth so that we can lift them up to all of their resilience, strength, beauty, capacity, potential, whatever words you want to use there. And so that was my dissertation. And then fast forward, Deborah and I decided that we would take this doctoral dissertation and make a book, create a book for the times we are in, so that we can offer strategies and practical advice to folks who are working with at-risk youth, and so that you have some tools and some new strategies that you could apply, rooted in the ancestors, the wisdom of the ancestors. Now, this book wouldn't have been possible without two people, well, three people, including Deborah. Stephen Burkhart, I know he was a guest on one of your community conversations a couple months ago. He's a 50-year professor at City University in New York at Hunter College. He is my mentor. He was the chair of my doctoral committee. Without him and his constant support of my work, this book would not have gotten written. And he was with us every step of the way on this process. And the other person I'd like to mention is Dr. Joy DeGruy. Dr. DeGruy, many people know her because she developed the concept called post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she also works with adolescents and high-risk youth, or youth from high-risk environments. And she is an expert around adolescent development. And she came up with this construct after spending years observing the kind of behavior and response to oppression and racism. Because as we know, there's no group of people in this country more assaulted than our Black men and Black brothers in this country. No more under assault. And she came up with the construct that helps us better understand the impact of systemic and the enduring legacy of enslavement in this country. All those injuries that we still have manifest today that have its roots in slavery in America and chattel slavery. So she wrote the foreword to the book, and Dr. Burkhart wrote the another foreword to the book. And without them, I'm deeply in debt to them both for joining Deborah and I on this journey. So practical tools for you. That's what's in this book. 16 strategies across the lifespan of the child is what we offer in this book. The research shows that reconnecting to history is vital and essential to the lives of Black children. This is more important than ever as Black families and communities are facing straight up assault, an attempt to erase the experiences of their Black lives. A core theme of our book is Black Lives Matter. We all know the mantra, but what does that mean? For too long, Black people's voices were unheard. The narratives that we highlight in this book, is 100 formerly enslaved people whose names we say, whose voices we allow to be heard. So if you want to hear the ancestors, you're going to get hundreds and hundreds of examples of their wisdom and their instruction through this book. And I want to turn it over to Deborah right now, because Deborah is going to also give us some of these examples of some of the narratives and some of the wisdom that's embedded in them. You're on mute, Deborah.
This is what happens when you're in more than one meeting in a day. You tend to mute yourself automatically, not being, with all the background and everything. Thank you so much for having us. I appreciate being with NASW New Jersey. A little background on me. I do have a background in education. I will never and have never taught middle school. I've taught everything else. I teach college, graduate school, everything else. Middle school, too many hormones running around. However, I am currently very steeped and very vested in child welfare. I am part of the child welfare system for the city of New York with the Administration for Children's Services. And the reason I say that is that's one of the reasons that I'm bringing this segment of you're going to see some of this stuff within the book, but you're also going to see some of this play out as we give you the tools that we have. So I'm going to let you know about one interesting example from the ancestor and how this plays out into what Barbara has just mentioned. So there's a slave called the Reverend Squires, and he's from Florida. And he has mentioned in the book, and he's also said that one of his experiences is that while his slave master was really kind of kind, and compared to others, he didn't get beat that much, but he was really, really political, which meant that a person of color could not learn to read and could not write. Reverend Squires, however, had the brilliance and the tenacity to learn to read and write, but he couldn't show this anywhere. So whenever the master was around, he would take his newspaper and notice, and you have to have clean and really clean ears. It's a condition of being a threat. And he would turn his newspaper upside down and have the master think that he was just too dumb to read it right side up. And still, he managed. So that's one example. And from that to this day, we have this system, and I learned this as a young person in the city schools of New York, to, shall we say, be seen and not heard. Shall we say that part of my experience was that, who did this drawing? It couldn't have been anybody in this class because I was the only Black person in the class. And when I raised my hand, I was told that and at the moment that once the principal thought it was brilliant, and then once he knew I did it, I automatically became culturally deprived. What are you talking about? In one sentence, you love this painting, no matter who did it. And then my color was now a weapon, and you became incensed. You became, how could she do this? And that kind of thing. If any of you know the old New York City school system well, I won't date myself too much, a while ago, you'll get what I'm saying. We were never considered part of the overarching achievement. And years later, and especially after I got my doctorate, I was told, we never thought you guys would advance. We never even thought about even trying to help you out and promoting you because we never thought you'd make it. And what was this grounded in? You know it, you guessed it, the formerly enslaved. And it was grounded in not who they were, but on the assumption of what they could not be. And I'll give you another example quickly here, if I can find it. I had it, okay. Actually, I can't find it now. Oh, I'm so sorry. I had it spilled out here. I had it. I want to give you exactly as it was done. The other example, and I believe her name is Wanda, and I'll do it from memory. She, later on when she was interviewed, said that she would look around this town and in her 60s could admit that she worked for every single family in this one town. Every single white family in the whole town. Can you imagine that? And what that did was that ordinarily, if she wasn't a woman of color, what would that have been? But she was. But she lived to tell the story. And again, there was this resilience, not only in surviving all the rudiments of slavery, but there was this resilience in making it past that. There was this resilience in saying, I'm going to have my own children and raise them. So that when I'm interviewed, and what a wonderful thing to be interviewed, excuse me, in 1934, to have survived this and to have a legacy of this. And part of what we're saying is that our kids and disenfranchised kids are tethered to this strength. So please look at that strength. I'm going to turn it back over to Barbara, and I'm going to look up this other sample because I had it. I got to find the right page.
Sure. Yeah, this is, as I said, there's over 2,000 of these stories in the collection that you have access to anytime you want to. And there are other narratives as well. You might be familiar with Frederick Douglass, wrote his life story. That was a slave narrative. I want to hearken the issue of W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote a book called Souls of Black Folks, right? And in this book, he raises the issue of something called double consciousness, okay? Now, when this collection was being put together, George Warwick was the person who edited the collection. And it's in 17 very nicely bound, 21 nicely bound books, these narratives. And George Warwick, the first book that he authored is called From Sun Up to Sundown. And this speaks to this reality for the American slave. And that is, from sun up to sundown was the time that was quote unquote master's time. And from sundown to sun up was the time of making Black community. So he wrote this, the first volume in this collection is called From Sundown to Sunup. And it speaks to the pernicious nature, the fervent desire for Black family to coalesce and be created, even in the midst of this peculiar institution. And I'm saying that to say, when I did this research and I was mining for these pearls of wisdom, something very interesting happened. It was very easy to see that there were clear strategies that individuals used that had to do with things that were innate to them. Like, did they have competency? Did they make use of spirituality? Did they have personal power and agency? So it spoke to them as individual people. And then next, it was very easy for me to see, as I continued to do constant comparison with his works, to see that there was definite family structure. And in the family structure, some very clear themes emerged, like cohesion, like warmth, like role modeling, like love and support, like getting basic needs taken care of, right? And then when we got to the community domain, it was very interesting because it speaks to this double consciousness. In their own words, they talked about a bifurcated community. They talked about having to live straddling the world of the enslaver and the world of their Black community. And so when we talk about strategies, and even with youth today, we have to always be mindful that Black youth in a segregated, most cities are very segregated, most communities are very segregated, most Black youth don't travel very far outside of their inner world, in their community, in their neighborhood, in their school, and their church, right? But they have to interact with the dominant culture. And my work over the years is what I've tried to put sustained focus on is how to get young people to interact in that world in a way that helps to move them toward their goals and move them toward their desires, right? So they have to straddle both worlds. They have to live in the world they're in. And sometimes we hear this as like coded language, different speak, different dress in one world when you have versus going into the dominant culture, right? And sometimes we have to work with young people to say to them, okay, yeah, you can be who you are, you can have your personality, you can have your style, but if our goal is to get you employed, then we have to talk about how you navigate the dominant culture, how you have success, how does your language change, how does your appearance get modified so that there's success. The success is getting you gold. I had a client he was a hacker. He was a computer whiz. I speak about him in the book. One of his competencies was that he would be, I was in a high school setting and I had a set of computer banks in this room that I was providing counseling and therapy in. And he would go on there and he would be able to do back end work. He'd be able to go behind all the, he'd be able to go anywhere he wanted to on the internet, even though there were prohibited places that he could not go, right? They were set up by the tech people, but he knew how to get around that. He was brilliant when it came to computers, right? So it was not a big stretch for me to say, when we were discussing his goals, what do you want to do? And he wanted to work with computers, right? So we found out about Google in New York City, who was hiring some interns. And we tried to we set that as a goal to get him to apply, to get him to interview well for that position, long story short, he got the job, he got the internship, right? And that changed his life. But it was based on what his skill set was. Now, look, I could have been the kind of person that turned him into the to the school counselors or the administrators and said, here's a kid who's breaking all the rules, going in behind your computers, changing and altering the websites the students could watch and access, and made this punitive. But what I saw was a strength. And I used that strength to then help him frame some of his goals for his future. He was 17 years old. He, like many students, he had a lot of difficulty with writing and comprehension and reading. We worked hard on this. We worked on giving him lots of tutoring. We gave him lots of support. We helped him to craft the essay. We interviewed, we rehearsed the interviews. We got him to the position where he could go in and he could stand up and represent himself and tell about his passion for computers. Like, let the passion come through. And that's what he wanted to dedicate his life to. And he got this internship, and it changed not just his life, but it changed the life of his entire family, because there was a stipend that was attached to this, internship. And this young person, extra money into the family, it changed the life of the family and himself, right? That's an example of at the individual level, how you can take a strength and how you can then move that, as our ancestors did, using their personal strengths and then moving themselves through the adversity in their lives with success and demonstrating the resilience. You know, Deborah and I joke about this. This book talks about critical race theory because we center the lives of our Black youth in their historical context. And so we joke around and we say, wow, we're publishing a book just in enough time for it to get banned because of the times we're in right now, right? But it is so clear that, again, with the straight up assault, it is an attempt to erase the experience of Black lives, and that we have to be, I'm a clinician, I do my 45-minute sessions with my clients, but then I have to do more. We all have to do more. Whatever your role is, whatever that is in social work, you have to do more. We have to do advocacy. We have to fight for policies that will alter the power arrangements in the dominant culture. We have to find allies, and we have to work in the Black community. We have to know the Black community. I can't tell you how many colleagues I've interacted with over the years who were not that familiar with the community in which their children, their clients were coming from, right? Walk the community, learn the community, go meet some of the providers and businesses in the community, go meet some of the church leaders and the other kinds of leaders in the community, go to a NAACP meeting, go to a Black Lives Matter march, like do more than do the 45-minute session. It's incumbent upon us to do that because children are, as we all know, are embedded in concentric circles of development. We have them themselves, the individual, their family. We have to get to know the family, provide supports to the family, and work on these tenets of the family that these formerly enslaved people have given us instruction around. You know, is it warm and cohesive? Are there good role models? Is there love and support? Never underestimate the awesome power of love and support. And we have to sometimes work with our families on how to do that. They have layers and layers of trauma, layers and layers of learning and unlearning to do. And we're in a unique position as providers, as social workers at every level of being able to move them and unpeeling that trauma, right? And I mean, you know, I will say this one thing about trauma. We did a study once in a ninth grade in a high school. Every single ninth grader was tested on a trauma inventory. And when we got the numbers, they were 10 times the norm for direct exposure to trauma and indirect exposure to trauma. Our children are traumatized. sometimes we have to look at some of their behavior and say, that's what a kid who's traumatized would do, right? They're in fight or flight. Their brains are swimming in cortisol. It's not supposed to be that way. Not supposed to be that way. Our brains aren't supposed to be swimming in cortisol, right? But if you lived in some of the life situations, some of the environmental situations that we find so many of our youth in, then we go, my God, that this child is alive is just a miracle. That this child even shows up to school is a miracle. That this child has the capacity to form relationships is just a miracle. And it is. And we have to start there and then move forward with them and building more and more capacity for resilience.
I agree.
Yeah, do you want to say anything more about that, Deborah?
I do, and I absolutely agree with, of course, everything you said. And it's unfortunate because trauma is not necessarily visible and certainly not worn on your sleeve. And yet there are pain pointers, there are triggers, and we can, but by the time we see them, it's really, really late. And so, and in addition to the call to action that Barbara just said about being more involved in the community and the family, and I know that you guys are, and I on the child welfare system, on the child welfare level, what's interesting is I always say whenever we speak that children do not put themselves into foster care. They're in this condition to no fault of their own. The condition is not a capacity issue, it's a situational issue. And with your help and with our help, and granted, I love all of you because you're in this profession and it's totally altruistic. I know you're not getting rich. But with your help, we can move all of our kids to places where they can become independent, to places where they can take their own place in this country and in this world. I'm going to give you quickly one other thing about what Barbara said. I always said my mother, my granddaughter, if she does what she says she'll do, she'll be a 5th generation teacher in this country. I personally think that's huge. I think that's wonderful. And the reason I bring that up, my mother taught 1st grade. I mean, she taught high school and everything, but she went back to 1st grade. She was a principal and went back to 1st grade. Excuse me. And she said, if a child anywhere in this country is not looking forward to going to 1st grade, riding a bus, getting a backpack or whatever, school supplies are fun, there's something wrong. At that point is the point that we need to start looking. At that point, when that child is to enter 1st grade and is resistant, we have a problem. We need to look at the home. We need to have the child assessed. We need to look at, and that's where we're losing them. We're not getting it that early, and we need to. So I hope that it's falling well on your ears. And the other thing I want to say is exactly what Barbara said. Look at the behavior and not the child. Because once you start looking at the child, whatever you're bringing to that, whatever your worldview is, whatever how you make sense of things comes into play. But if you look at the behavior and deal with the behavior and modify the behavior, we can talk differently and we can move that child to better outcomes and more positive outcomes and better experience in the world. So that's what I wanted to add, Barbara.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's clearly a confluence of things that happen to Black and brown youth that don't happen to other youth, that don't happen to white children. They are traumatized by assumptions, stereotypes, racism, and the othering that Black children experience every day in their lives, right? So this is a fact that we have to be mindful of when that young person, that precious child, is in front of us. And listen, if you don't think that child's precious, you shouldn't be working with that child. If you don't think that child's precious, you shouldn't be working with them. Right? We have to have a floor here. And the floor is that child is worthy and that child's life matters and they're precious. And if that's the attitude one has in doing the work with Black youth, then that sets the tone for all the encounters to come, that they are precious and they need some skills and they need love and support and they need to be heard and they need to be made visible and they need empowerment, right? And the same with parents. Like I had this experience, I tell about it in the book here, where I was working with a student who had very foul language, and she just couldn't help herself. Like, I mean, just every other word was a curse word. And we it wasn't like I was like, you have to stop cursing. No, I had to kind of understand this. And no better way did I understand this than the first time I met her mom. And when I met her mother, every other word out of mom's mouth was a curse word, right? And so there you had it, right? So that had to shift. I had to shift my way of thinking about how I work with this child and try to get some better outcomes for this young person, which meant I had to work with the family system as well. If you're working with children, you must work with the family as well. It's really important. And then I up the ante a little bit more. I also work with the peer group, right? You tell me who your 3-4 best friends are, and let's get you in. And that became group therapy. It became group work, right? So I work with the individual, I work with their peer group, I work with their families. And then I saw these outcomes really starting to manifest. Because you have to inspire young people. And I know are we getting close to the time, Jeff?
We have
We're
about,
getting close to the time, right?
so yeah, we have about 20 minutes left. So if you have,
Okay.
that's fine.
Yeah.
Try and leave like 15 minutes for Q&A.
Sure. I want to say that we have to inspire young people. We ourselves can be inspirational because we show up every day. We come prepared. We come to listen. We come to understand. Right? And I can guarantee you there aren't many people in their lives that do that for them. Right? Just us doing that in our sessions, in our work, in our encounters makes a huge difference. It's inspirational to young people. Right? Connecting them to their history is inspirational. Not only is it essential, but it's inspirational. When they get into these stories, and you can pull them up on your desktop in a nanosecond, read some of these narratives to your students. Let them hear the wisdom from their ancestors. Acquaint them with their history. Hopefully you're in a school district where you're allowed to do that. You're in a situation where you can do that. I mean, God forbid they take that away from us as social workers, the way they're taking it away from educators. Right? So we all know that what got transmitted through slavery, and I'll end on this, what got transmitted through slavery to the modern times are all the vestiges and the injuries of chattel slavery. We call them disparities, ongoing oppression and systemic racism, right? We see it play out in many different kinds of systems, right? But not only is that true, but what is equally true is what got transmitted through time is the resilience of the enslaved. And that is what we're leaning heavily on in this book, to say, make use of this, make use of their wisdom, make use of their pearls of wisdom. That is called Sankofa. Sankofa is a West African term, came from Ghana, and it's symbolized by, I don't know if you can see this on my arm, that is a mythical bird called Sankofa. It is West African in nature, and it's part of a funerary language, so that when you died, they would take cloth and empanel these cloths with a choice of 125 different Adinkra symbols. One of these Adinkra symbols is called Sankofa. What does Sankofa mean? Sankofa means to go and fetch what you need to stay alive. Go back and get what you need to live today. And other ways you can say this is, in order to know your future, you have to know your past. You have to go back and fetch it, and you have to bring it forward and make use of it so you can survive. That is Sankofa. So the way we constructed this book is we give you lots of examples, lots of excerpts from the slave narrative collection. we'd like to introduce you to these amazing men and women who were enslaved. And then we also share case vignettes throughout the book from Deborah's teaching experiences and child welfare experience, and my experience as a clinical social worker. And then we provide for you at the end of every chapter something we call Sankofa guidance. And this is where we just get right to the heart of things, to the nitty gritty, right? So if you want to know what are some of the nitty gritty things you need to do when working with an an individual, go right to Sankofa guidance. And we just don't spare any sweet talk there. We just go right to the heart of the matter. And the same for working with Black families, the same for working in the Black community, and the same for dealing with the dominant culture. So this is the book. It's called Inherited Wisdom, Drawing on the Lessons of Formerly Enslaved Ancestors to Lift Up Black Youth. It is published by Cognella Academic Press. We are hopeful that people will see it for what it is. Lots of practical and useful ways to apply the history and the wisdom of formerly enslaved people for work with Black youth today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Milton, Dr. Brooks Lawrence. Appreciate you sharing what you've learned from your work in this field and in creating these pathways so that we can learn the lessons of the ancestors. We have about 15 minutes left, so I would very much like to welcome those of you who have questions to raise your Zoom hand, and we will call on you to unmute. Tasha is asking in the name of the book. The book title is actually the same as the title of this webinar. It's Inherited Wisdom, Drawing on the Lessons of Formerly Enslaved Ancestors to Lift Up Black Youth. People can find that online, Barbara?
Yep, you can buy it straight from Cognella Academic Press or Barnes & Noble's, Amazon. It's available everywhere. Thank you, W. Williams. Thank you.
Do we have questions for either Dr. Milton or Dr. Brooks Lawrence? Go ahead and put them in the chat or raise your Zoom hand. While we're waiting, I guess
Welcome, Tasha.
one of the things that I'm wondering as we're waiting are direct clinical applications of what you're learning. So there are actually times that you are bringing some of these narratives into session with you, Barbara?
Absolutely.
Sharing
Absolutely.
specific stories as examples?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think as we all know, there's a disconnect from the elders, right? How many times have you said that? Young people today are disconnected from their elders. It is a real crisis. And part of what we have to do is reconnect them to their elders. And when I say elders, I mean going way back to the ancestors as well. So that was always an objective of mine in treatment, was to connect, find out who their elders were, and to engage them also in our process, and reconnecting kids to the wisdom of the elders, right? And just that connection itself is an intervention. But yes, I used to frequently draw in, I call it, it's called bibliotherapy, right? So you bring in all kinds of books and all kinds of reference material. And I used to include, W.E.B. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and then these body of works as well, these narratives, right? So, and one thing that I remember a student who said, and I think I write about this in the book, who was blown away. There was a Reverend Squires who was 14 at the time the Civil War started. And prior to that, he was held as an enslaved man, an enslaved boy. And when he found out what the war was all about, every part of his fiber wanted to fight in the war against, for the Union, against the Confederates. But he couldn't because he was 14 years old. And that was a regret he had all his entire life. When he was interviewed, he was 99 years old when he was interviewed. And that was the one regret he had, that he could not fight in the war and fight for his freedom. But he did so as an adult. He voted. He was very involved in his church. He was his church. And he spoke about empowerment and freedom and liberation. He had like a liberation theology. It was part of what his, he had a liberation theology. Now, I remember sharing that story with one of my clients who actually had bipolar disorder. And she would cycle around. And when she was manic, she was a college student, when she was manic, she would participate in every kind of march, every kind of social justice cause imaginable. That's how she cycled through her mania. She would, she'd be out there fighting, for racial justice. She'd be fighting for reproductive justice. She'd be fighting for the environment. This is how she would cycle through her mania. And then when she was depressed, she would use drugs to self-medicate. And, she reminded me a lot of Reverend Squire in that. And when I shared that story with her about Reverend Squire, she was like, empathized with him, because there were some causes that was so righteous, like the cause of the Civil War, to free blacks, to free the enslaved, and yet he couldn't do it. And she got so, it was such an empathy that she developed for him as we read through his story and read through his entire narrative. And he went on to make this life for himself, where he made a conscious effort to work for the betterment of the Black man, the betterment of the Black community. And she saw a little bit of herself in him, and that kind of turned her on. It made her think about herself in a very different way. She got to see that she's part of a long history of Black men and women who stand up and crusade for social justice, who stand up and work for the betterment of their race and of their people. And that filled her with a pride that I had never seen her have before. It filled her with a pride, and it filled her with a sense of purpose. That was because of the connection we made through the narratives in session. In session, we did that. I see somebody's hand is up here.
Yeah, is that, sorry if I mispronounced, Rihanna or Rena?
No, you got it. It's Rihanna.
Rihanna. Hi.
Hi, Rihanna.
Hi, Dr. Milton. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about the book. I will be putting a request to order it for our office library.
Oh, thank you so much.
I just had a question. So I work with, in my my caseload is primarily African-American women and young women, ages 18 to 25. I think, our agency is pretty, is very diverse. And typically, when I have these conversations with my youth, or I find really great resources like this book, I typically have that conversation with my coworker who, we're a very small team. It's just the two of us. And she is an African-American woman, and she usually takes, does the groups or facilitates and organizes that type of thing. I guess my question is, as a white woman, utilizing this book in case management, how would I do that in a genuine way? I mean, I'm so far been using curiosity, because I am, I do my own research and I come back with that, but I just wanted to know how I could be involved as as a genuine ally in that.
Oh, thank you for saying the A word. It's a very important word. We have a whole chapter about allyhood. That's chapter 5 in our book. So yeah, what do our white allies do to help lift up Black youth? That's a very important question. And the fact that you asked the question is a really good one. So chapter 5 in our book talks about what those in the dominant culture can do to be partnered with Black youth, their families, and the Black community, right? It talks about, there are some strategies there. There are 4 strategies that we lay out in the book for that domain. And it centers itself around brokering resources. It centers itself around connecting, negotiating, brokering, and advocacy. And also, there's a policy domain in that domain, right? So who controls the levers of power? And how do we manipulate those levers for the best interests of this Black child, right? So you have to ask yourself, what access to power do I have? What access to policy do I have? What access to resources do I have? And how do I leverage all of that in the best interests of this child, right? What does that mean? How do I do that, right? So we lay out some of those techniques and some of the strategies in that chapter. That's a very important question to ask yourself. The majority of our Black youth in schools are taught by white teachers. Most professionals that our Black youth are interacting with tend to be white professionals, right? And it matters that you find them precious. It matters that you encounter them as precious whole human beings. As Deborah said earlier, you're seeing beyond the behavior to the child, right? Yes. A kid's gonna peep that very quickly if you're not coming at him in that way. You have to, look, I always say this in all my work, all my considered education over the years. Here's a fundamental truth. Love works, right? It's about love. Love children. If you can't come from that standpoint where you exude love and respect and you find that child precious, you're in the wrong field. This is what young people need. This is what young people need. You know, I didn't have to go get a doctorate degree to learn about the awesome power of love, right? And positive regard for our young people, right? I know as a young person, that's what I wanted more than anything in the world, right? And unfortunately, I had a parent who couldn't give it to me because she had layers and layers and layers of trauma. And where did she inherit that from? Her parent, her mother, who had layers and layers and layers and layers of trauma. And where did she get hers from? Her mother, who had layers and layers and layers. They did the best they could with what they had, and they survived brutal times. My mother survived the 50s as a lesbian woman in Camden, New Jersey. And she survived that, all right? But boy, I always say, you can't get ice cream from a hardware store. And my mother was a hardware store. She was tough and rough. And a lot of our kids are parented by parents who are stealing them for the world. The world is harsh and rough, and they're doing the best they can. I know Joy DeGruy used to tell a story about some enslaved persons on the auction block, and the mother and the child on an auction block. And so when the purveyor came by and he's assessing this child, and the mother standing right next to him on the auction block, and the purveyor is going, you know, oh, I like this. Let me see the teeth. Let me see. He's oh, he's a good buck. Oh, this is the one I want. And then the mother says, no, you don't want him. He's no good. He's lazy. You don't want this kid. You know, that's not how you want. Now, why did she say all of that in front of that potential slave owner? She said it because she didn't want this child to be removed from her. you know, because that's what happened all the time in enslavement, right? The families were fractured and fragmented and torn apart, right? But let me tell you something. While that was a good strategy in 1862, is not a good strategy in 2022. And too many of our parents still do that. You know, they go, oh, you don't want to give him anything because he's no good. You know, he's like parents. So many of our parents don't know how to draw on the esteemable attributes of their own children because they think they're toughening them up for the world. And we have to show them there's another way to make them available to the world. We have to show them there are new ways that we can prepare them for the world, that holds their esteem intact, that doesn't injure them further than the injuries that they're already accumulating on a day-to-day basis, just by being Black youth and Black skin. So, so that's a lesson I learned from Georgia Grew. Go ahead, Deborah. You're on mute, my friend.
Okay, I'm back. Thank you. I really, really appreciate that question. I'm going to tell you why, because I don't care if the youth is green. There's no authenticity in care that comes through. And I did not have a Black teacher, professor, social, anybody until I was in graduate school. And even that, no, I take that back. Oh, yes, I did. I had one. And to be honest with you, she was self-admitted Black. I couldn't tell offhand. But the point is, I'm saying all that to say, I didn't see myself. And there were some who were, just as I told you, we didn't expect you to survive. We didn't expect you to make it, yada, yada, yada. But then there were some with the authentic care and said, you are something. We can share who you are with this world, which translated to keep going, which translated to I see your strength, which translated to you have resilience, just like my white counterpart sitting next to me. So thank you so much. Please, please, please continue asking those questions. I appreciate it, as he said, the courageous conversations. I'm just going to say quickly, I was just in a meeting with professionals and she said she was afraid. Her constituents were afraid to bring up questions in this area. And I'm thinking, do you know who you're talking to? Can you see me? Do you see me? Hello, this is one time I want you to know I'm Black. Can you see me? And she said, we were afraid because we don't want to say the wrong thing. And I said, well, I appreciate that. And I really do appreciate that. Please ask, because if you're genuine, it'll come across as such. If you're not, who's gonna know? We're gonna be right back where we started and stagnant and unfortunate. I'm so sorry, Linda has a question.
Yeah, I think we're at the witching hour here.
Oh, okay. Well, it was about resilience. And
no, go ahead. Go ahead,
both
Linda.
of you mentioned this one, you both mentioned one particular individual who was there and gave you a connection, right? And they say that all we need is one really strong emotional connection, this authenticity that you're talking about, no matter who it comes from. But can you talk about what was it in you that had the seeds of that resilience, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just this one person. It was almost like you were just waiting for that person to come along, and then you grabbed onto the encouragement and recognition of your greatness. But
sure, yeah. As I said before, what gets transmitted through generations is resilience. That's where the seeds come from. Like I got them from my mother. Like I saw her struggle, I saw her stress, I saw her. My mother was beat up by cops because she was a lesbian woman in the 1950s, when she was harassed when they raided a speakeasy they were at. I mean, and then I saw her get up and go to work the next morning, and I saw her work 3 and 4 jobs because she wanted a 60-inch flat screen TV. And she's just like, the man ain't going to give it to me. I got to work for it. Right? Like I learned a lot about grit. I learned a lot about tenacity. I learned a lot about honoring commitments and showing up, and so I got it. I know my resilience comes directly from my mother. And I know
Mhm.
hers came from her mother. So I happen to ascribe it to the matriarchal line in my family. 'Cause I don't know the patriarchal line in my family. I never knew who my father was.
Me too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess even if some of our ancestors' generations never quite made it in the way that we talk about making it here in
Yeah.
America, in the
Yeah.
this
right.
day and age. We saw, I mean, I saw my mother work hard and
Mhm.
her mother worked hard. And
That's right. Well, that's
Even
why the
though-
Sankofa
Yeah.
principle is so salient, because it encaptures that right there. It's like we go back to fetch what we need in order to be okay moving forward, right? So we can go back to our mother, our grandmother, our great-grandmother, our great-grandmother, and track it all down and see what's there for us that we can make meaning of today that helps us move forward in our lives. That's what Sankofa
to
is.
notice
And before we-
that other than
yeah, and before we leave, I just want to say that I want to recognize
said
one
that,
other
I
person,
just noticed that everybody here are women except for Jeff.
except for
Thank
Jeff. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff.
Jeff is
Thanks for
representing.
representing, Jeff.
Jeff is representing.
Yes.
And I want to recognize one other person in the room before we head out, and that is Vivian Tadini, who's in the space. She is the person who put the Cognella link in the chat for anyone who wanted to order the book. She put that info there. She's a dear friend. Thank you so much, Vivian, for being here today with us. Thank you so much.
And thank you both for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your wisdom and your insight. We are going to have to wrap, but I will follow up within the next 24 to 48 hours. I'll send out the recording of this webinar so that you can rewatch it, share it with your friends, and for those who couldn't attend, they'll be able to watch it as well. Dr. Milton and Dr. Brooks Lawrence, are you okay if we share your contact information in that email as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Please
I am.
do.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you all very much, and you enjoy your week, and we'll see you all at our next community conversation. Be well,
Yeah,
everyone.
thank you so much for coming out,
Thank you,
everybody. Thank you, Jeff. Be well,
Thank
everybody.
you, Jeff.
Be well.
You represent well, Jeff.
Hey,